Breaking news tonight. A senior U.S. official confirms to NBC News that Israel did indeed strike targets inside Syria tonight. Official declined comments when asked if it was chemical weapons related. Joining me now, NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, what do we know about this strike and when it happened and what the intent was and whether the Americans knew beforehand?
It's not clear whether the Americans knew beforehand, Chris, but whether they yellow-lighted it or green-lighted it, they will deny knowledge beforehand. What we do know is that several sources are now telling us from U.S. official sources that Israel did on Friday strike against targets believed to be connected to delivery systems for chemical weapons. That it's not clear whether or not Israeli airplanes crossed into Syrian airspace, but these were targets apparently that were involved in weapons that were being delivered to Lebanon, and that is something that Israel has said that they would prevent happening. Now, a spokesman for the Israeli embassy has said that while not commenting on these reports, they tell me Israel is determined to prevent the transfer of chemical weapons or other game-changing weaponry by the Syrian regime to terrorists, especially to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So what seems to have happened is that some weapons were allegedly being delivered to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Israel took action based on their intelligence, and it came at the same time as the U.S. government, Chris, was getting more intelligence today from a top UN weapons inspector visiting Washington that there had been chemical weapons used by the regime. Chris?
Thank you, Andrea. We also know that the Israelis have struck once before in January. There was one other confirmed airstrike inside Syria. I guess my question is, does this escalate things or cross some line or escalate things in a way that there is no going back now in terms of Israel's involvement, in terms of the regional nature of the conflict, or can we see things walked back from this point?
It's unclear as to what is going to happen. It will depend on how the rest of the world reacts, whether other countries in the region, particularly Arab countries who have been very concerned about the Assad regime, support what Israel has apparently done. Israel, as a proxy, of course, will be viewed as a proxy for the United States by much of the anti-American sentiment in the region. But this is a clear shot across the bow, and it is saying to the Assad regime that you have crossed a line that the rest of the world is not willing to tolerate, except, of course, for Iran and Russia, who are the strongest backers right now of the Assad regime.
Andrea, I wonder here what this now puts on the table of the president. I think Barack Obama has been remarkably careful and judicious in the way that he has discussed things. The red line that you just mentioned, which Israel has been, I think it's fair to say, diplomatically pushing the U.S. to acknowledge as a clear, bright thing that has been crossed. The president has been a bit more textured and nuanced about. Is this a way of provoking the Americans to do something? I mean, what does Barack Obama now have before him as the decision points when he comes and addresses the nation tomorrow, or when he's in a meeting in the sit room as we speak? It's
really a very complex relationship because Israeli officials, Michael Oren, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, was on MSNBC with me last week, very eager to say that Israel was not pushing the U.S. into action. And at the same time, the Arab world is deeply divided. Turkey and Qatar have both been supporting the more radical elements, according to U.S. officials, in the rebel forces. At the same time, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the Emirates, and Jordan have been arguing very forcefully, King Abdullah of Jordan here in the U.S. last week, arguing very forcefully that they have to support the more moderate elements. Only today, Richard Engel on the Turkish border interviewed General Idris, who is the head, the military leader of the Syrian forces, who the U.S. now believes, according to the CIA and other intelligence experts, are more moderate, are less Islamist, are more secular. And that has been the hope of the administration. They were hoping to either arm them or get weapons to them or better training to them and not put Americans on the ground. Also, we should point out John Kerry, the Secretary of State, is going to Moscow on Monday. That is a very important play, but all of the international experts I've spoken to, ambassadors from other countries, are saying that there is no way that Vladimir Putin is going to back away from the Assad regime. So with the support of Iran, with the support of the really tough al-Nusra Front, who is supported by al-Qaeda factions, and the support of Russia, it's right now the balance of power is more or less with the regime. What Israel has done today, though, may change the balance of power. This is a very strong warning to Assad.
Our understanding from U.S. officials, and again, this is preliminary reports, so we are taking this from unnamed officials, which are reports that I think there's always a little bit of grain of salt that we should approach this with. But the unnamed officials, the U.S. officials, told NBC News that it was believed that the weapons that were struck were actually on their way out, right, from Syria to Lebanon to Hezbollah, and there's been a lot of concern growing, particularly among not just Israel, but other players in the region, the U.S., about Hezbollah increasing involvement in the war that's happening in Syria.
Exactly. And one of the big concerns has been Scud missiles. We know that Scuds can reach not only Israel, but also American forces, NATO forces in Turkey. The Scuds have quite a range. And Syria has a huge arsenal of weaponry and of chemical weapons. So if there were a concern that Scuds that could deliver chemical weapons to Israel via Lebanon, that would be a play that Israel would take. Israel has made it very clear that they are not going to hesitate to take what they say is defensive action against any use of chemical weapons.
There was a really interesting bit of reporting from Eli Lake in the Daily Beast about the chemical weapons and our knowledge of it in Syria. And it suggested that we actually, U.S. intelligence and even Israeli intelligence, doesn't have a great sense of where the chemical weapons are. You got to wonder what the next step is here. Like how keyed in are U.S. intelligence officials to what targets there are to strike if strikes are going to happen, or is everyone flying blind here?
I would not say that they're flying blind, but the problem with chemical weapons, obviously, is you can't hit the chemical weapons depots themselves without risking a worse contamination. So you have to, if you're going to have a military plan, and we have military plans on the shelf, the U.S. does, and certainly the Israelis do, you have to hit the delivery systems or the troops that are going to arm the weapons and actually launch them. So you have to hit targets that are associated with chemical weapons, but not the chemicals themselves. And one of the problems, of course, has also been the mobility of this. And the president had said back in August that he would not permit the Assad regime to cross that red line. There has been a lot of concern, though, that the actual evidence is not as hard as the president said himself, that the evidence has to be absolutely airtight before they would go to the world with this. They are very, very conscious of the mistakes that were made with weapons of mass destruction by the Bush regime.
And the president also has been very cautious, not just in verifying this intelligence, which as you've been discussing on your program, Press Secretary Carney and the president himself, when he took to the podium earlier, saying basically the red line is not just necessarily the confirmation of a one-time use or the appearance of weapons, but actually something like their systematic deployment. They've been very clear about where that red line is. It appears that Israel's conception of that red line is actually quite different than the U.S. And we've seen this before in other regional conflicts. We've seen it on Iran, in which the U.S. and Israel have made independent judgments about what the threshold for action are. What we are seeing tonight, apparently, and again, if you're just joining us, senior U.S. official confirms to NBC News Israel did indeed strike targets inside Syria tonight. Official declined comments whether it was chemical weapons related. What we are seeing this evening is Israel going ahead and acting on their threshold before the U.S., or we don't know whether with the tacit approval of the U.S. or not, but certainly before the U.S. has acted.
Well, what we are hearing in this very carefully worded statement from Israel is a non-denial denial and confirmation that they would stop any weapons that they thought were heading to Lebanon and Hezbollah. That can be taken as confirmation from the Israelis that indeed something has happened and that it did involve what they claimed, at least, were weapons that were intended for hostile forces inside Lebanon.
Hezbollah, of course, a Shia militia and political force inside Lebanon that has been allied quite strongly with the Assad regime, has been increasingly fighting in the conflict in Syria, which, let's remember, began as a small nonviolent resistance in the Arab Spring, has become, because of the violence by the state and suppression on the rebels, has become an armed resistance. That armed resistance has now grown into a regional conflict increasingly. There has been tremendous concern about where this is all headed. And tonight, right now, we have news that we may see a very significant escalation. Once again, we are confirming, NBC News, that Israel has struck inside Syria against some weapons target. It is unclear at this point whether it is chemical weapons related. There is some reporting indicated that it was believed, a U.S. official saying it was believed it was a shipment of weapons headed for Hezbollah in Lebanon. Andrea Mitchell, are you expecting, the president right now is in Costa Rica. He's been on this trip. In fact, I believe we do have a little bit of sound from the president earlier today before this news broke, talking about his approach to Syria. Do we have that? Can we play that?
As a general rule, I don't rule things out as commander-in-chief because circumstances change, and you want to make sure that I always have the full power of the United States at our disposal to meet American national security interests. Having said that, I do not foresee a scenario in which boots on the ground in Syria, American boots on the ground in Syria, would not only be good for America, but also would be good for Syria. And by the way, when I consult with leaders in the region who are very much interested in seeing President Assad leave office and stabilizing the situation in Syria, they agree with that assessment.
Andrea Mitchell in Washington, thank you so much for joining us with this breaking news.